5 elite Navy SEALs. Laser sights painted dead on her chest. In the scorched ruins of a black site outpost, Gunnery Sergeant Clara Vance, a legendary Marine combat master, didn't even raise her rifle. She just looked the lead SEAL dead in the eye and whispered a single word: "Don't." 5 seconds of suffocating silence followed. 5 seconds that would determine who walked away and who became a ghost in the sand. How did America's most lethal Marine find herself hunted by her own country's ultimate shadow unit? And what happens when those 5 seconds run out? Don't blink, because the story behind this standoff changes everything you think you know about special operations. The military doesn't give out the title of Combat Master on a whim. It is a ghost title, spoken of in whispered conversations across elite training compounds like Quantico and Coronado. To earn it, you don't just have to survive, you have to master every conceivable way a human body can be used as a weapon. Gunnery Sergeant Clara Vance didn't look like a myth. Standing at 5'9", with sharp emerald green eyes and a face hardened by the harsh sun of 3 combat deployments, she looked like a soldier who had seen the abyss and made it her home. Her hair, dark and sweat-matted, blew across her face, partially obscuring the fresh, bleeding shrapnel cut on her left cheek. But beneath that calm, battered exterior lay a tactical mind that operated like a supercomputer. Clara was the primary instructor for the Marine Corps' Advanced Close Quarters Tactical Program. She had trained raiders, recon Marines, and even foreign intelligence operators. She knew the exact biomechanical failure points of the human frame. She knew how a man shifted his weight right before he pulled a trigger. She knew how fear smelled. And right now, the air around her smelled entirely of fear, burning JP-8 aviation fuel, and betrayal. The setting was Outpost Horizon, a desolate, crumbling military compound deep within a lawless border sector. Officially, the outpost had been decommissioned 2 years ago. Unofficially, it was a joint task force data relay station, a place where highly classified satellite feeds were routed before reaching the Pentagon. Clara had been sent there on a solo evaluation mission. Her objective was simple: audit the physical security measures of the automated facility and retrieve a corrupted encrypted hard drive. It was supposed to be a routine, low-risk assignment, a walk in the park for a combat master. But 3 hours after her arrival, the base's primary communications array didn't just malfunction, it was deliberately severed from the inside. The secondary backup generators were sabotaged. Within minutes, the perimeter motion sensors flickered out, plunging the outpost into a tactical blind spot. Clara had felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. In her line of work, coincidences were just poorly hidden ambushes. She had moved quickly, transitioning from an auditor to a predator. She didn't lace up her heavy tactical vest. Instead, she stripped down to a simple, torn white tank top and her standard-issue tan combat trousers. Weight was the enemy of speed, and in close quarters, speed was life. She slung her customized M4 carbine across her back, checked the retention on her combat blade, and slipped into the shadows of the central command tent. That was when the sky brought the storm. Through the heavy haze of the desert dusk, she heard it before she saw it, the low, muffled thump-thump-thump of a helicopter. But this wasn't a standard medical evacuation chopper or a supply bird. The rotor signature was too quiet, too refined. It was an MH-6M Little Bird, a Black Ops platform utilized almost exclusively by Tier 1 assets. It flew in blacked out, no navigation lights, no transponder signal. Clara watched from the heavy canvas flap of the tent as the chopper hovered mere feet from the cracked earth, kicking up a violent storm of dust and sand. 5 figures detached themselves from the aircraft with fluid, terrifying precision. They didn't move like ordinary infantry. They moved like a single, multi-headed organism, weapons raised, scanning fields of fire with absolute synchronization. Even through the dust, Clara recognized the gear. The high-cut maritime helmets, the quad-eye night vision goggles tucked up on their brows, the suppressed HK-416 rifles. Navy SEALs. But they weren't here on a rescue mission. Clara's tactical radio, set to an encrypted emergency scanning frequency, suddenly crackled to life with a brief, cold burst of static. A voice, low and devoid of emotion, spoke into the comms. Target is isolated inside the perimeter. Crimson Control confirms no witnesses. Retrieve the drive, eliminate the asset, and sanitize the site. 5 minutes out. The realization hit Clara like a physical blow. The data drive she had secured in her tactical pouch wasn't just a routine maintenance log. It contained something worth killing a Marine combat master for. The command structure that had sent her here had deliberately set her up. They had sent the Navy's most elite shadow operators to ensure she and whatever secrets were on that drive never left this desert alive. Outside, an unexpected explosion tore through the eastern fuel depot. A rogue mortar round? A pre-planted charge? The blast illuminated the compound in a violent orange glare, throwing long, monstrous shadows across the cracked earth. 2 support soldiers from the outpost's minimal skeleton crew who had rushed out to investigate the comms failure were cut down in a fraction of a second. The suppressed bursts of the SEALs' rifles were barely audible over the roaring fire, but the efficiency was unmistakable. 2 bodies dropped into the dirt without a sound. Clara's blood ran cold, but her mind remained ice clear. The rules of engagement had just changed. It was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a war for survival. She stepped out of the command tent, walking deliberately into the open, smoke-filled courtyard. She didn't run. She didn't seek cover. She knew that against 5 Tier 1 operators, running only invited a synchronized crossfire. She needed to dictate the terms of the engagement. As the smoke cleared, the lead SEAL operator rounded the corner of a ruined supply truck. His rifle barrel swung toward her instantly, the infrared laser sight painting a bright, invisible dot right over Clara's heart. Within a millisecond, 4 other operators fanned out into a flawless semicircle, completely cutting off her avenues of escape. They had her dead to rights, a 5-on-1 bottleneck. But Clara stood her ground, her arms hanging loosely at her sides, mere inches from her waistline. Her eyes locked onto the lead operator's visor. She could see his finger tightening on the trigger. She knew exactly what he was calculating: the wind, the distance, the clean chest shot. But she also knew something he didn't. She knew that at a distance of less than 7 feet, a firearm is a liability if the opponent moves faster than your nervous system can process. The air grew heavy. The roaring flames of the fuel depot behind her seemed to fade into a distant murmur. The dust hung suspended in the air like crushed glass. Clara drew a slow, steady breath, looked into the barrel of the rifle, and spoke that single, shattering word: "Don't." And then the world stopped turning. 5 seconds of absolute, dead silence commenced. To the untrained eye, 5 seconds is a mere blink of an eye. In the world of Tier 1 special operations, 5 seconds is an eternity. It is enough time for a human heart to beat 5 times, for a high-velocity bullet to travel over 4,000 yards, and for a tactical plan to completely disintegrate into chaos. As the word "don't" left Clara's lips, it hung in the heated, smoke-filled air like a physical barrier. The 5 Navy SEALs surrounding her did not immediately fire. For an elite operator, the decision to pull a trigger is governed by the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. Clara's sudden appearance and her absolute lack of a defensive posture had completely short-circuited their orientation phase. They had been briefed to expect a desperate, fleeing rogue asset hoarding classified data. Instead, they found a lone woman, bleeding but unbroken, staring down their barrels with the icy composure of an executioner. The lead operator, whose laser remained centered on her chest, felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Through his ballistic visor, his eyes adjusted to the flickering orange light of the burning fuel depot. He took in her silhouette. The torn white tank top, the grease and blood smeared across her skin, the combat trousers, and above all, those piercing, emerald green eyes. He knew those eyes. Anyone who had ever passed through the Advanced Joint Service Combat Tracking course at Pendleton knew those eyes. "Hold fire," the lead SEAL commanded over the team's internal comms network. His voice was a tight, low rasp. He slowly lowered his rifle by a fraction of an inch, though his weapon remained oriented on her centerline. "Gunny Vance?" Clara didn't blink. The blood dripping from the shrapnel wound on her left cheek tracked a dark line down her jaw, but her posture remained perfectly balanced. Her feet were shoulder-width apart, her weight distributed evenly on the balls of her feet. To a novice, she looked unprotected. To a fellow master of close-quarters combat, she was a coiled spring. "You're tracking off your brief, Miller," Clara said, her voice smooth and entirely devoid of panic. She recognized the operator's voice and his physical frame. Master Chief Aaron Miller. A veteran of countless shadow operations, a man who prided himself on surgical precision. "Crimson Control lied to you. They told you I was a hostile foreign actor. They told you to sanitize the site. But you and I both know what happens to the cleanup crew once the dirty work is done." The other 4 SEALs remained perfectly still, their weapons tracking her every micro-movement. But the psychological dynamic in the courtyard had shifted. The absolute certainty of an execution had been replaced by the suffocating weight of doubt. "We have our orders, Clara," Miller replied, his voice tightening. "The drive you pulled from the server array contains compromised signal intelligence. It belongs to a closed-loop network. You weren't authorized to access it." "I didn't access it to steal it, Aaron. I accessed it because the automated distress beacon was triggered from inside the Pentagon," Clara countered, her eyes shifting slightly to analyze the geometry of the men surrounding her. The tactical layout. Operator 1, Miller, directly in front, 6 feet away, weapon lowered slightly, mentally conflicted. Operators 2 and 3, fanned out to her left and right at a 45-degree angle, weapons locked on her torso. Operators 4 and 5, flanking the rear, maintaining a wider perimeter to prevent any sudden athletic escape. Clara knew she couldn't outrun a bullet, but she also knew that the human reaction time to an unexpected visual stimulus is approximately 0.2 seconds. If she could manipulate that window, the odds would shift. "The data on this drive proves that Outpost Horizon wasn't decommissioned because of budget cuts," Clara continued, keeping her hands completely still to avoid triggering a reflex shot. "It was turned into a digital black site to route unauthorized surveillance on American citizens. Crimson Control isn't a military command, it's a rogue cabal within the defense intelligence sector. If you kill me and take this drive, your chopper won't make it back to the carrier. You'll be the next accident reported in the evening news." "She's stalling, Master Chief," the operator to Miller's left muttered over the radio, his weapon twitching slightly. "We are on a strict timeline. Command is monitoring our telemetry. We need to clear the sector." Miller was caught in a lethal paradox. He knew Clara's reputation. She was a Marine combat master, a title held by fewer than 10 active-duty personnel across the entire Department of Defense. She had literally rewritten the textbook on close-quarters combat tactics that his own team used. If she said there was an ambush waiting for them, ignoring her was a death sentence. But disobeying a direct order from a Tier 1 command structure meant treason. "5 seconds are up, Clara," Miller whispered, his voice heavy with grim resignation. He began to raise his rifle back to his eyeline. "I'm sorry." In that final millisecond of the 5th second, Clara didn't wait for him to complete the motion. She didn't try to draw her rifle. Instead, she exploited the one thing the SEALs hadn't accounted for, the structural integrity of the environment around them. Directly above Miller, A heavy, charred wooden support beam from the burning command tent was creaking under the intense heat of the nearby fuel fire. Clara had noticed the structural failure 3 seconds ago. Before Miller's finger could squeeze the trigger, Clara violently stamped her right foot onto a loose, cracked piece of concrete beneath her, shifting her entire body weight backward in an explosive backward leap. Simultaneously, she drew her combat blade with her right hand and threw it, not at Miller, but at the frayed, tensioned steel cable holding the remnants of the command tent's canopy directly above the SEAL team. Snap! The cable severed with the sound of a whip cracking. The massive, burning canvas structure, weighed down by heavy iron grommets and burning debris, collapsed instantly over the front 3 SEAL operators. "Move! Move!" Miller shouted, but the blinding sheet of fire and heavy canvas smothered their vision, plunging the tight semicircle into absolute directional chaos. The 2 rear operators immediately adjusted their fields of fire, their suppressed weapons coughing in rhythmic bursts, thwip, 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 as they blind-fired into the smoke where Clara had been standing a fraction of a second ago. The rounds tore through the dry earth, kicking up miniature geysers of dust, but Clara was already gone. She had vanished into the thick, choking black smoke of the burning fuel depot, moving with the silent agility of a predator in her native habitat. She didn't look back. She knew the canvas wouldn't hold Tier 1 operators for more than a few seconds. They would cut themselves free, reorient, and hunt her down with systematic fury. The standoff was over. The hunt had begun. And in this scorched desert outpost, the Marine Combat Master was no longer just a target. She was the apex predator in the dark. The thick, greasy black smoke from the burning JP-8 fuel depot was Clara's greatest ally. As she slipped deeper into the skeletal ruins of the outpost's vehicle maintenance bay, she knew exactly how the Navy SEALs would react. They were Tier 1 operators. They wouldn't panic. They would immediately transition to their advanced thermal imaging and infrared optics to track her through the haze. But Clara had calculated for that. In a high-temperature environment, thermal optics become a liability. The raging fire behind her radiated massive waves of infrared energy, creating a phenomenon known in tactical circles as thermal masking or whiteout. To the SEALs' sophisticated quad-eye night vision goggles, the entire eastern sector of the compound looked like a blinding, pulsating wall of white fire. Human body signatures were completely swallowed by the ambient heat. They were fighting blind in a high-tech sandbox. Inside the dark, corrugated iron maintenance bay, Clara pressed her back against a rusted steel support pillar. Her breath was slow, rhythmic, and shallow, a technique known as combat breathing, designed to keep her heart rate below 100 beats per minute. When the heart races, fine motor skills degrade and peripheral vision narrows. A combat master could not afford to lose either. She looked down at her hands. She had no primary weapon. Her M4 was still slung across her back, but in these tight, pitch-black corridors filled with twisted metal and abandoned engine blocks, a long rifle was a liability. It risked scraping against a wall, making a metallic click that would give her away her position instantly. She unclipped her rifle and laid it silently onto a pile of discarded rubber tires. Now she was armed only with her bare hands, her tactical training, and a profound understanding of her environment. Outside, the sound of tearing fabric signaled that Miller and his team had cut themselves free from the collapsed command canopy. Clara heard the sharp, disciplined clicks of magnetic throat microphones as the team re-coordinated their search patterns. "Stack up on the maintenance bay." Miller's voice echoed faintly through the smoke, his physical location roughly 40 yards away. "Spread out, interlocking fields of fire. She's slick, but she's cornered. Non-lethal takedown if possible, but do not risk the team. If she raises a weapon, neutralize." Clara closed her eyes, letting her auditory senses take over. She heard the crunch of tactical boots on broken glass. One operator was approaching from the eastern bay door. Another was flanking the western perimeter. They were executing a classic pincer movement, closing the jaws of the trap. The operator approaching the eastern door moved with agonizing slowness. He held his HK-416 at the ready, his weapon tracking every shadow.
This was Operator 3, a hulking, highly decorated combat veteran known within the community as a specialist in close-quarters clearing.
He stepped through the threshold of the bay. The fatal funnel, the dangerous open doorway where tactical operators are most vulnerable, was behind him. He was inside. The mechanics of the ghost takedown, the blind spot. In a dark room, a human scanning with a weapon naturally prioritizes corners and wide spaces, often ignoring the immediate vertical space directly behind the doorframe. The strike. A targeted impact to the carotid sinus induces a sudden drop in blood pressure, causing instant, temporary unconsciousness without permanent neurological damage. Clara didn't wait for him to sweep his weapon toward her pillar. She didn't make a sound. As the operator passed her position, his focus locked on the dark far corner of the bay. Clara stepped out from the shadow of the pillar directly into his blind spot. Her movement was fluid, almost liquid. Before the operator could register the shifting air pressure behind him, Clara's left hand shot forward, gripping the hot suppressor of his rifle and forcing the barrel downward toward the concrete floor. Simultaneously, her right hand delivered a brutal, open-palm strike to the side of his neck, targeting the carotid artery. The operator's eyes widened in brief, shocked recognition, but the physiological response was instantaneous. His brain was deprived of oxygen for a crucial fraction of a second. His knees buckled. As he fell forward, Clara caught his heavy, 90-pound tactical kit before it could crash against the floor and create an acoustic spike. She guided his limp body silently onto the dirt, stripped his tactical radio from his vest, and snatched his suppressed sidearm, a customized Sig Sauer Tombat pistol. She clicked the stolen earpiece into her own ear just in time to hear Miller's voice crackle through the encrypted network. 2, status report on the western flank. 3, report on the bay. Silence followed. 3, report status, Miller repeated, his tone sharpening from calm authority to cold alertness.
Clara pressed the push-to-talk button on the captured radio. She didn't speak. Instead, she clicked the transmitter twice, the universal tactical signal for interrupted or compromised communications. Outside the bay, Miller halted his advance. His team instantly dropped into low, defensive crouches, weapons oriented outward in a 360-degree security perimeter. The atmosphere in the compound grew so tense that the crackle of the nearby fire felt like artillery explosions. 3 is down, Miller whispered over the comms, his voice tight. She didn't use a firearm, no acoustic signature. She's inside the maintenance structure. Switch to white lights and high-intensity strobes. Disorient her. We go in together. Clara smiled grimly in the darkness. She had forced them to abandon their stealth. By forcing them to use white lights, she now knew exactly where they were looking, where they were moving, and how fast they were closing in. They were no longer invisible ghosts. They were targets illuminated by their own technology. She slipped further into the labyrinth of the maintenance bay, heading toward the rear exit that led to the underground utility trenches. The real battle wasn't just about surviving this night. It was about getting the encrypted data drive out of this desert and exposing the people who had pulled the trigger on this operation. But as she reached the back exit, the metal door violently blew inward with a deafening crash. A flashbang grenade detonated in the tight corridor, filling her vision with a blinding white sheet of light and a roaring, concussive pressure wave that threatened to tear the consciousness from her mind. A flashbang grenade does not just blind you, it violently overwrites her entire nervous system. At 7 million candeladas of light and over 170 decibels of concussive sound, it triggers an instantaneous overload of the optic nerve and destabilizes the fluid in the inner ear. The world becomes a roaring, featureless sheet of absolute white. Your balance vanishes, your brain screams for orientation, but the senses provide nothing but a flat line of agony. To an ordinary soldier, this is the end of the fight. To Gunnery Sergeant Clara Vance, it was a known variable. As the concussive wave hit her, Clara didn't try to look away or cover her ears. The movement would have been too late anyway. Instead, she instantly dropped her center of gravity, sinking low to the cracked concrete floor. She slammed her left palm flat against the deck. She didn't need her eyes to find the earth. She used the physical vibration of the ground as her new baseline orientation. Her ears rang with a high-pitched, deafening hiss, a textbook case of severe auditory exclusion. But beneath that hiss, through the palm of her hand flat on the concrete, she felt it, a rhythmic, heavy thudding. Footsteps, fast, aggressive, and perfectly spaced. Operator 4 was breaching the threshold. He had anticipated her escape route into the underground trenches and had set the perfect trap. He was moving in for a swift, overwhelming takedown while she was sensory-deprived. Clara closed her eyes tightly behind her eyelids to let the purple, pulsing after-images of the flash chemical burn dissipate. She counted the vibrations in her palm. 1, 2, 3. He was exactly 4 feet away, moving along the left wall of the narrow corridor. Tactical disadvantage analysis. Vision, 0%. Total whiteout or after-image distortion. Hearing, 10%, severe tinnitus, acoustic trauma. Spatial awareness, dependent entirely on kinetic memory and tactile feedback. Opponent, fully equipped Tier 1 operator with clear vision, moving at high velocity. When you cannot see, you do not strike blindly. You bait the opponent into making contact, and then you use their own momentum as a roadmap to their weak points. Operator 4 rounded the final corner of the ruined doorway, his weapon raised, his tactical flashlight strobing to further shatter her visual tracking. He saw Clara crouching, her head hung low. He assumed she was completely incapacitated. He transitioned his weapon to his left shoulder, reaching out with his dominant right hand to secure her in a high-compliance joint lock. The moment his thick, Nomex-gloved hand clamped onto Clara's left shoulder, he realized his mistake. Clara didn't pull away. She exploded toward him. Using his grip as a pivot point, she swung her entire body inside his guard, tracking his physical mass entirely by the point of contact on her shoulder. Her right hand, holding the captured Sig Sauer pistol, didn't try to aim. She used the frame of the weapon as an extension of her fist, driving the heavy steel slide directly upward into the underside of the operator's ballistic helmet, striking his jawline with bone-shattering force. The operator's head snapped back, his night vision goggles flying off their mount. But he was an elite warrior. Despite the dizzying blow, his muscle memory kicked in. He dropped his rifle, letting it hang on its tactical sling, and wrapped both arms around Clara's waist, driving her backward into the jagged, exposed sheet metal of the blown-out door frame. The sharp metal tore into the fabric of Clara's white tank top, slicing into the skin of her ribs. Pain flared through her torso, hot and sharp, but she compartmentalized it instantly. In the arena of survival, pain is just information. It tells you where the boundaries are. With her back pinned against the wall, Clara dropped the pistol. In this phone booth distance, firearms were useless. She drove both of her thumbs directly into the soft tissue beneath the operator's jaw, pressing upward against the glossopharyngeal nerve. It was a compliance technique taught only at the highest tiers of martial mastery. The excruciating, radiating pain caused the operator's grip to loosen for a fraction of a second. That was all the window she needed. Clara hooked her right leg behind his knee and twisted her torso with violent, core-driven torque. The operator lost his footing on the debris-strewn floor, and both of them went crashing down into the darkness of the open utility trench below. They fell 6 feet, landing heavily on the rusted iron piping of the automated drainage system. The air rushed out of the operator's lungs in a ragged gasp. Clara rolled away instantly, her vision finally beginning to clear, returning in blurry, washed-out shades of gray and high-contrast shadows. She looked down at the man. He was struggling to breathe, pinned beneath a heavy section of dislodged pipe. She could have ended his life right there. She had his own combat knife within arm's reach. Instead, Clara knelt beside him, her breathing heavy but controlled. She reached down and pulled his tactical radio headset from his helmet, slipping it over her own ears. her emerald eyes, cold and focused, locked onto his face through the gloom. "Tell Miller," Clara whispered, her voice cutting through the damp air of the trench, "that if he keeps following me into the dark, I'll stop holding back." Above them, back in the maintenance bay, the beam of a heavy tactical flashlight cut through the smoke. Master Chief Miller's voice echoed down the corridor, tight with an urgency he rarely allowed himself to show.
4. Status. Do you have visual on the asset? Clara looked up toward the opening of the trench. She could hear the distinct sound of Miller and the remaining active operator clearing the room with methodical speed. The trap was resetting, and the space was shrinking. She didn't waste another second. She turned away from the fallen operator and vanished into the pitch-black, narrow labyrinth of the underground utility trenches, moving deeper into the belly of Outpost Horizon. The underground utility trenches of Outpost Horizon were never designed for human combat. They were narrow, concrete arteries built to house high-voltage conduits, primary water mains, and heavy fiber-optic cables. The air down here was thick with the stench of stagnant water, ozone, and rusted iron. The intense heat from the burning fuel depot directly above radiated through the concrete ceiling, turning the subterranean maze into a literal pressure cooker. Sweat mixed with the dried blood on Clara's face, stinging her eyes, but her gaze remained fixed on the darkness ahead. She moved with an unnatural, gliding gait known as the hunter's stride, a method of locomotion where the knees remain slightly bent, absorbing the impact of each step so that the head stays perfectly level. It minimized any vertical shifting of her silhouette and ensured that her footsteps made absolutely no acoustic impact on the damp floor. In her left hand, she held the encrypted data drive she had retrieved from the surface station. Her thumb traced the hard metallic edges of the casing. This small piece of hardware was the catalyst for the entire nightmare. It wasn't just data, it was a death warrant. Through the captured radio earpiece tucked into her left ear, she heard the grim reality of her situation unfolding on the surface. "Medevac is on standby, but we don't have time," Miller's voice crackled through the encryption, his tone dropping into a dangerously calm register. 3 and 4 are stable but incapacitated. The asset is intentionally targeting non-lethal nerve clusters. She's neutralizing our numbers without committing capital offenses. She's playing a political game in a tactical theater. Or she's just showing us mercy, Master Chief. The voice of Operator 2 responded. He was the last remaining man on Miller's team, elite point man specializing in subterranean tracking. A combat master doesn't miss an artery unless she wants to. "Doesn't matter," Miller snapped back, though there was a distinct note of hesitation in his voice. "Mercy doesn't change the parameters of the mission. If that drive leaves this perimeter, the entire infrastructure of our command structure collapses. Enter the utility access point. 2-man wedge formation. Stay close, cover the angles, and watch the shadows." Clara halted. She pressed her back against a massive, vibrating water valve. The sound of her pursuers descending the iron ladder 40 yards behind her echoed through the pipe network. Subterranean acoustic paradox. In a confined concrete tunnel, sound does not travel in a straight line. It bounces off hard surfaces, creating acoustic mirrors. A sound made on the left can seem to originate from the right, completely disorienting an operator's spatial awareness. Clara knew this paradox intimately. She looked at the parallel lines of rusted steel piping running along the length of the trench. She reached down, picked up a small discarded brass bolt from the floor, and gently wedged it between a high-tension steam line and the concrete wall. She didn't throw it, she didn't drop it. She simply tightened it until the thermal expansion of the pipe caused the metal to creak. Ping! The sharp, metallic resonance vibrated through the length of the pipe, echoing down 3 different intersecting corridors simultaneously.
To Miller and Operator 2, who had just stepped off the ladder, the sound seemed to originate from a junction box 30 feet to their immediate right. "Movement right," Operator 2 whispered, his weapon snapping instantly toward the dark corridor. He stepped forward, his high-intensity weapon light throwing a tight, blinding beam into the gloom. "Hold, too," Miller cautioned, his veteran instincts flaring. "Don't isolate yourself." But Operator 2 was already executing a textbook tactical slice of the corner, his eyes searching for the source of the noise. He advanced 3 paces into the side tunnel, his rifle raised to his eye line. He didn't look down. Clara wasn't hiding in the side tunnel. She wasn't even standing. She had utilized the deep, water-filled drainage gutter that ran parallel to the main pathway, a trench within a trench, covered only by a thin, rusted iron grating. She had slipped beneath the grating into the freezing, murky water, using a discarded piece of rubber conduit as a makeshift snorkel to breathe, while the heavy silt hid her body completely. As Operator 2's heavy tactical boot stepped onto the metal grating directly above her face, Clara acted with explosive, terrifying speed. Her hands shot upward through the gaps in the rusted grating, gripping Operator 2's ankle with a vice-like hold. With a violent downward jerk, she shattered the rusted structural welds of the grating. The metal collapsed. Operator 2 yelled as his right leg plunged through the floor into the muddy water below, his balance completely destroyed. As he fell, his rifle discharged into the concrete ceiling, the deafening roar of the unsuppressed muzzle blast echoing like thunder through the tight tunnel system. Before he could reorient his weapon, Clara exploded out of the water like a specter. She didn't strike his face. Instead, she grabbed the heavy ballistic plate of his tactical vest and used his own falling momentum to flip him cleanly over her shoulder, driving his back into the hard concrete wall of the trench. The impact dislodged his night vision array and sent his rifle skittering into the dark water. Clara pinned his chest with her knee, her left hand locking his throat, while her right hand rested mere millimeters above his eyes, her fingers curled into a lethal strike formation. Operator 2 froze. He looked up into those emerald green eyes glowing with an intense, untamed fury in the dim light. He felt the absolute certainty of death pressing against his throat. "Don't move," Clara whispered, her voice barely a breath against the damp air. "You're a good soldier. Don't die for a lie." She reached down, unclipped his primary radio hub from his shoulder, and tore the battery pack from it, completely severing his link to the surface. She didn't hit him. She didn't break his bones. She simply leaned back into the shadows as the sound of heavy, rapid footsteps approached from the main corridor. Master Chief Miller rounded the corner, his weapon raised, his face twisted in a mask of grim determination. He swept his light across the scene, the shattered grating, his point man pinned and disarmed in the dirt, and the empty, dark tunnel extending into the deep belly of the base. Clara was gone again. Miller lowered his weapon by an inch, looking down at his remaining active operator. "You all right, son?" Operator 2 sat up, coughing up a mouthful of dirty water, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound respect. "She had me, Master Chief. Clean shot. She could have taken my head off. She chose not to." Miller didn't answer immediately. He looked down the long, dark corridor where the Marine Combat Master had vanished. The realization was finally settling into his chest. This wasn't a tactical retreat. Clara Vance wasn't running away from them. She was leading them exactly where she wanted them to go. She had systematically stripped him of his entire team, one by one, without spilling a single drop of American blood. Now the sandbox was clear. There were no more teams, no more tactical units. It was just the Master Chief and the Combat Master, alone in the dark, heading toward the final junction point of Outpost Horizon. The final junction point of Outpost Horizon was the subterranean server vault, a reinforced concrete bunker buried 40 feet beneath the desert floor. This was the heart of the digital black site. The air here was chillingly cold, cooled by massive, humming industrial air conditioners that contrasted sharply with the roaring inferno raging on the surface. Rows of server racks pulsed with eerie green and blue LED lights, casting long geometric shadows across the room. At the far end of the vault stood the primary uplink terminal, and waiting beside it, completely calm, was Gunnery Sergeant Clara Vance. She had used the last remaining minutes to plug the encrypted data drive into the main console. A massive progress bar flickered across the terminal monitor. Uplink to Pentagon main resistance node, 92% complete. The heavy steel security door of the vault hissed open. Master Chief Aaron Miller stepped into the room. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his rifle with the frantic panic of an amateur. He moved with the slow, terrifying deliberation of a man who had hunted in every dark corner of the globe. His weapon was up, his optics tracking Clara's chest. He was the last man standing of his elite 5-man unit. The tactical radio earpiece hung loose around his neck. He had turned it off. There was no one left to talk to. "It's over, Clara," Miller said, his voice echoing flatly off the concrete walls. "Step away from the console. Delete the uplink. If you do it now, I can still bring you in alive. I can guarantee your safety." Clara looked at him, a faint, weary smile touching her lips. The green light of the terminal reflected in her emerald eyes. "You're a legendary operator, Aaron, but you're a terrible liar," Clara countered softly. "Look at the auxiliary screen to your left. Don't take my word for it. Look at the automated protocol Crimson Control just initiated the moment your team's tactical telemetry went dark." Miller's gaze flickered for a fraction of a second to a secondary diagnostic monitor on the wall. Crimson Control Protocol. Status: Operation Sanitize Compromised. Automatic Countermeasure. Outpost Horizon Fuel Depots overridden. Action: Thermite demolition charges armed in the main server vault ceiling. Time remaining, 60 seconds. The rogue command structure hadn't just betrayed Clara, they had built a failsafe to liquidate the SEAL team the moment the mission deviated from the script. Crimson Control was burning the evidence, the base, and the operators alive. "They never intended for you to go home, Aaron," Clara said, her voice cutting through the hum of the servers. "They needed a rogue Marine combat master dead, and they needed a heroic Navy SEAL team tragically lost in a training accident to cover the budget discrepancy. We are both loose ends." Miller's face hardened beneath his ballistic visor. The absolute reality of the betrayal hit him with the weight of a freight train. For 20 years he had followed orders blindly, trusting the chain of command with his life and the lives of his men. Now, that same chain of command had turned the keys to his execution chamber. "The uplink needs 40 seconds, Clara said, stepping away from the console, her hands open and visible. "We can fight for the next 40 seconds, Aaron. We can find out who is truly the best close-quarters combatant the Department of Defense ever produced. But whoever wins that fight won't have enough time to clear the blast radius of the thermite charges. Or we finish the mission that actually matters." Miller looked at the monitor. 95% complete. Then he looked at Clara. The silence that followed was identical to the 5 seconds in the courtyard. It was a vacuum of time where history hung in the balance. With a slow, heavy sigh, Miller lowered his HK-416 rifle. He reached down, unclipped the heavy sling from his shoulder, and set the weapon gently onto a server crate. He pulled his combat knife from his vest and slid it across the floor away from them both.
"How do we get out?" Miller asked simply. "The ventilation shaft behind the primary server rack leads directly to an old irrigation pipeline 200 yards south of the perimeter," Clara replied, her voice instantly transitioning back to sharp tactical efficiency. "It bypasses the entire fuel depot blast zone." Beep! The terminal screen flashed a bright, solid white. Uplink successful. Data distributed to all requisite oversight committees. Simultaneously, a sharp electronic klaxon began to wail through the bunker. Red emergency lights overrode the blue glare. High above them, the structural steel of the ceiling began to hiss and groan as thermite charges ignited, dripping molten, white-hot iron down into the server bays. "Go!" Miller shouted. The two ultimate operators, the Marine Combat Master and the Tier 1 Navy SEAL, moved in perfect, synchronized harmony. They didn't speak another word.
They dove into the ventilation shaft just as the main server bank exploded into a catastrophic wall of blinding, white-hot chemical fire. 2 hours later, the desert was silent again. The smoke from Outpost Horizon was a distant, dark smudge on the horizon against the rising morning sun. In the shadow of a canyon wall miles away, 2 figures stood by a stolen civilian transport vehicle. Master Chief Miller looked at Clara Vance. His uniform was scorched, his gear stripped, but his eyes were clear. "My men are safe. The medevac picked them up from the perimeter before the final blast," Miller said. "But as far as Washington is concerned, Gunnery Sergeant Clara Vance and Master Chief Aaron Miller died in that bunker." "Good," Clara said, adjusting a dark civilian jacket over her torn clothing. Her emerald eyes looked out toward the open road. "Let them think they won. It makes them careless, and a careless target is the easiest one to take down." She turned, stepped into the vehicle, and drove away into the vast expanse of the American desert, leaving the ghost of Outpost Horizon behind her. The Shadow War had just begun, and the Masters of Combat were finally holding the pieces. Gunnery Sergeant Clara Vance proved that no matter how elite the trap, a true Marine combat master dictates the terms of survival. But the shadow network known as Crimson Control is still out there in the dark, and they now know she is hunting them back. What do you think? If Master Chief Miller had pulled that trigger in the first 5 seconds, would he have walked away, or did Clara have him beaten from the very start? Let me know your tactical analysis in the comments below. If you want to see the next chapter in this cinematic military shadow war, make sure to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and smash the like button. It tells the algorithm that real, high-retention storytelling still matters. Thank you for watching, and stay sharp out there.